In 2014, I had the chance to be a part of an exciting educational project, designing a minor in education in the undergraduate program of a liberal social justice-oriented university in the south of India. The vision was exciting for me because this university was dedicated to reimagining teacher preparation in this country. We were a vibrant bunch, a mix of young ed professionals and veteran teacher educators, and we were given a fresh canvas to create the program. I enjoyed the design process, the robust discussions, research, and vibrant imagination exercises. A lot of the education programs in India are in a rut. They are based on outdated theory and often not taught as well as they could be. The idea of being a part of the solution to this problem was very meaningful to me. In addition to working on designing the minor in education, I was also involved in several other aspects of the undergraduate program. But not all of it was smooth sailing. I soon became unpleasantly aware of a toxic work culture in some of the area I was contributing to. There was a lot of gossip, backstabbing, and harsh judgment of anyone seeking to maintain any sort of work-life balance. There was also no formal process or channel for any faculty member who wished to raise objections or concerns about this kind of culture. All this clearly signaled that the institution didn't really see these problems as problems at all. As the months went by, this dysfunctional work culture was getting to me. I began to feel increasingly unsafe emotionally, and this presented as a waning enthusiasm. Inside, I was still very excited and driven about designing, refining, and teaching in the education minor. But there was this opposite pull running in parallel, the need to protect myself from the toxic work environment. At the time, I didn't view this instinct for self-preservation favorably. My inner voice kept saying, "Buck up, or you need to become stronger." I felt ashamed that I was feeling so dispirited and demotivated. At times, I'd feel a flash of courageous outrage, but I felt like I was largely at fault, that the institution was above improvement, and the fault lay with me, and that I was basically weak and inadequate. In short, I was feeling vulnerable, a mess. Why couldn't I just overlook the toxicity and work on my dream endeavor? I couldn't talk about this with colleagues I was close to or felt safe with because my feelings of inadequacy and shame held me back. I was worried that they'd confirm my worst fears, that they too would see me as weak. And then, when it got to a point where even my pet project just couldn't bolster my spirits, I finally sought professional help. With compassion and emotional safety, my therapist helped me see that it was completely natural, in fact healthy, that I was recoiling from a toxic work environment because I was recognizing the need to prioritize my mental health over career progression this time. I drew on this modeling of compassion to become kinder with myself. I shifted into acknowledging that maybe I don't have the personality that powers through an unpleasant environment like a blinkered horse. Feelings of inadequacy faded away. I was able to start talking to some of my close colleagues about my vulnerabilities in this work environment. Self-compassion plays a big role in our ability to embrace vulnerability. Research captured in a 2021 Sage Journals article titled "You and I Both, Self-Compassion Reduces Self-Other Differences in Evaluation of Showing Vulnerability" tells us that self-compassion reduces your tendency to see your vulnerability in a negative light. Cultivating self-compassion helps you be realistic about difficult circumstances and avoid spiraling into an exaggerated view of the challenges you face. So if we think back to my story about the minor in education program, rather than view myself as inadequate for not being able to function in such a work environment, self-compassion helped me reframe the whole situation. I was now able to see what I initially thought of as a vulnerability or a personal failing as a completely reasonable response to an incredibly challenging environment. Self-compassion also helped to free me up and share my vulnerability with my colleagues. And when I did, they were empathic and understanding, proving that others view our vulnerability in a kinder way than we do, and confirming the beautiful mess effect that I mentioned in the introductory lesson. Here, I want to take a few moments to revisit the assignment I gave you at the end of the introductory lesson. I asked you to tune into yourself using two questions. When do you feel comfortable about showing your vulnerability? And conversely, what is it about a situation or a person that makes showing your vulnerability a disconcerting proposition? Thinking about your answers to those questions, do your responses change considering the research on self-compassion and its effect on embracing or showing vulnerability? Now let's dig deeper into what gets in the way of showing vulnerability. If it's so effective at creating close and authentic connections, why does it feel so hard? Why do so many of us work so hard to avoid it? If a relationship lacks emotional safety, you will feel scared about exposing your rough edges and losing the affection, respect, and admiration of the person you so want a connection with. So the biggest challenge to sharing or showing vulnerability is the fear of losing connection. To overcome this, you must first recognize that this is a legitimate fear. In her book, Daring Greatly, social worker and researcher Brené Brown defines vulnerability as, and I really love this definition, uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound at all interesting or exciting to me. It's terrifying. So if you feel uneasy at the prospect of being vulnerable, you're certainly not alone, and you'd be forgiven for wondering what the upside of being vulnerable is. But here, I want to link back to something I shared in the introductory lesson. Being in touch with and showing your vulnerability helps you lead an authentic life, something that is also key to meaningful relationships and growth. So while self-compassion helps us to show our vulnerability without worrying too much about how we appear in other people's eyes, courage is an important piece in embracing vulnerability. Being in touch with our vulnerability requires courage. And yet, in the words of Brené Brown, you can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. Here's another articulation of Brown's understanding of the nuanced link between courage and vulnerability. Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. I love that quote. Let's dig into these perspectives a bit. It seems what Brown is suggesting about courage and vulnerability is that one can't exist without the other. And let's look at her description of rumbling, which I really like. Open quote. A rumble is a discussion, conversation, or meeting defined by a commitment to lean into vulnerability, to stay curious and generous, to stick with the messy middle of problem identification and solving, to take a break and circle back when necessary, to be fearless in owning our parts, and as psychologist Harriet Lerner teaches, to listen with the same passion with which we want to be heard. More than anything else, when someone says, let's rumble, it cues me to show up with an open heart and mind so we can serve the work and each other, not our egos. Close quote. This articulation helps us see that the element connecting vulnerability and courage is the intention and commitment to conversation. But let's be clear. Both parties need to agree to rumble. Otherwise, it'll be an emotionally unsafe interaction or relationship for one, if not both. So now that we've seen the advantages of vulnerability and that it really is worth practicing, let's look at some foundational perspectives that can promote the embracing of vulnerability. Brené Brown's extensive research points out that vulnerability needs to be a consciously adopted perspective or behavior, consciously adopted. As she says, you have to lean into vulnerability. In an article called Leaning into Vulnerability by the School of Life, there's an important tip to help you do this. And it ties into the ideas of the beautiful mess effect. The tip is to remember that we are all equally awkward, underconfident, and afraid. When you remember this, you can generate the compassion to be vulnerable and hold space for the vulnerability of others as well. In a talk by Blake Rogers titled How to Be Vulnerable and Why, you'll hear him talk about something that you might relate to: closing up and becoming invulnerable after you've been hurt. This is a predictable, understandable response. But as he explains, you're not just protecting yourself from future emotional pain, you're also stifling future personal growth. Understanding that closing yourself off emotionally can keep the gifts of connection and growth beyond your reach can help you adopt the behavior and skills needed to stay open, vulnerable, and connected even after you get hurt. Another crucial aspect of embracing vulnerability is understanding what vulnerability is not. Here I draw on the wisdom of Brené Brown again, where she elaborates in her impeccably nuanced and detailed way why vulnerability must be accompanied by the understanding of boundaries. In a podcast called Taken for Granted, Brené Brown on what vulnerability isn't, Brown explains why being vulnerable must come with a side of solid, healthy boundaries. Knowing what you are okay and not okay with is integral to being vulnerable and building individual and relational well-being. Efforts to lean into your vulnerability must go hand in hand with conversations in your social groups and communities as well. Linking back to the idea of the rumble, we must commit as families and communities to collectively lean into vulnerability. Otherwise, an individual being vulnerable will feel unsafe if they're doing it all on their own. Also, it is the commitment to vulnerability as a community that can truly help us listen to each other, respect each other, and create a life of equality. In this first lesson, you've seen that self-compassion can help you lean into vulnerability more comfortably. Good boundaries make leaning into vulnerability safe. And I've seeded the thought that an individual's vulnerability is supported and can be contributive in a social context that appreciates and commits to vulnerability. I encourage you to try tuning into vulnerability and sharing it with others to see where it takes you and what it does for the relationships and communities that you are a part of. In my next lesson, I'll unpack why vulnerability is such an important requirement for personal and relational well-being, and why being strong and unbeatable always has its costs. To find out what they are, join me for lesson 2.